Okay, people, B'ezrat Hashem, we're doing topics of Torah. We're doing parasha, class number 2. Let's pick it up now with this week's parasha. So we spoke last week in general about Bereshit, some ideas about the creation of the world. And now, B'ezrat Hashem, let's focus on this week's parasha, Parashat Lech Lecha. Okay, little background. How do we get to Lech Lecha? What happens in Lech Lecha? Very beginning, what does Lech Lecha mean? Meir, what does Lech Lecha mean?
It means to go.
To go. Who's going?
Uh, uh, Abraham.
Abraham. God speaks to Abraham. God speaks to Avraham. Or actually, his name right now is still Avram. His name wasn't changed yet. Eventually, his name is going to be changed by the end of the parasha to Avraham with a hey, which means the Av Hamon Goyim, the father of many nations. But now he's only Av Aram. He's only the father of those from Aram, from the Mesopotamia area, from the Iraq, Iran area. But Avram, God tells him, Lech Lecha, leave it all behind and go to the land of Israel. Okay, let's talk about a bigger idea. What was God's original plan for the world? Originally, Hashem came out and was like, you know what? I want to create a world. You know, Isaac, should we ask you like a really hard question? Isaac, ready for like a
Sure.
okay. Both Isaacs, any of Isaacs who wants to speak over here, okay? Really hard question for any of the Isaacs. What was God's original plan? You know, Avram's the first Jew, but Avraham is only after 20 generations. We have 10 generations to Noach, 10 generations to Avraham. So what was the original plan? Any ideas? So there's an idea that originally God God originally wanted to show that maybe we could have a world, a whole world that could worship Hashem, that can come together. Everybody out there will be proper and follow God's ways. But 10 generations went down, and then in last week's parasha, the world got very bad. They did what the pasuk says is Hamas, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that we got to destroy the world. That was last week's parasha with Noach, and he starts over. But again, Hashem starts over globally. Let's have Noach and his kids. Let's have them do something really good. But if you go down generation by generation, actually, if you go down 9 generations, they have the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babel, last week's parasha, where again they try to wage a war against God. This one is not as bad as the generation of the flood, but ultimately it's still pretty bad. And then God looks around and says, you know what? Let's get to this next 10th generation. Let's get to the 20th generation from the creation of the world. And God says, I have a new plan. This concept of having the whole world worship me and be good and that, it's kind of not working. So let's come up with a different idea. And what's the idea that Hashem has? Let's start with a nation. Because there's this one guy, Avraham. This one guy, Avraham, is making a balagan. He's making a lot of problems because he actually believes in God and he's trying to teach it to the world. And God says, I like this guy, Avraham. He knows what he's doing. Let me try something new. And that's when the Jewish people and the concept of a nation take place. And now this nation is supposed to have a role. If before God has expected the whole world to like recognize God and serve God, now God's coming along and being like, okay, Allah, you know what? Maybe that's too ambitious. New idea. Let's start with one guy who's going to build up a family, and that family is going to be a nation. And then Be'ezrat Hashem, let that nation become what's known as Or LaGoyim. Let them be a light unto the rest of the nations, and maybe that could change the rest of the world, move them in the path towards perfection, because I need my base. And we are now the base for God. We are the base whose job is to show the whole world what God is all about. Okay. So at the start of the parasha, God speaks to Abraham and says, Abraham, Alo, I like you. Lech Lecha. It's time for you to leave it all behind. It's time for you to just move out and start over. We're going to go to this land. And in the beginning, from the simple read of the pasuk, he doesn't even tell him where this land is going to be. I'm going to show you where to go. He's going to lead him to Canaan. He's going to lead him to the land of Israel. And then Be'ezrat Hashem, we're going to start to make something big. We're going to make something big. We're talking about, you have to realize how many thousands of years ago Avram was. And look at us here still today, you know, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, but we're still the top of every single news station in the world, trying to make our noise about how to be good people, trying to obliterate evil from the world. That was HaKadosh Baruch Hu's plan with Avraham. Let them be a light unto the nation. Let us be the ones to teach the world how to be good, how to be godly, how to be holy. Okay. Now, was Avraham the first one to try to get to the land of Israel? You hear the question? Lech Lecha, this main thing, leave it all behind and go to the land of Israel. Anybody know?
What do you mean by that? Like in the world ever?
Was this the first one to make this journey to
No,
Israel.
obviously not. There were people living there.
Okay, so there were some other nations already there. The Canaanites had already been there. If we go to the genealogy of last week's parasha, Noah has a bunch of kids, and a bunch of them become Canaanites who are from his grandson Canaan. They're going to take over the land of Israel. Okay, they were already there just because of regular immigration. But did anybody else at least from the history book of the Torah, for anybody in the Torah actually try to make this aliyah to Israel before Avraham? Not saying the locals that were there that moved there in the beginning with original initial immigration. Did anybody else feel this great mission that they want to now go to the land of Israel? Huh? Avram's the first? Raise your hand if you think Avram was the first. Avram was the first? First one in the Torah to make a journey to try to get to Israel? Raise your hand if you think yes. Avram's the first. Raise your hand if you think no. Isaac, why no? Just the question, or you actually know who was earlier? Okay, all those that raised with the no, because that's kind of where I'm leading towards. Anybody know where? Where do we find that Avram was? Okay, let's open up last week's parasha, because it's black and white in last week's parasha, but nobody pays attention. Because so much happens in last week's parasha. We talk about Noah and the flood, and then afterwards what happens on the ark, and post-ark, what happened with his son, all the craziness over there. Then we speak of the Tower of Babel. Then there's a whole long list of genealogy of 10 generations until Avram, of everyone that's being born. And people kind of forget along the way what the very end of last week's parasha speaks about. We actually read it twice last week because we read it in the maftir on Shabbat as well. So we read it in the 7th aliyah, and we repeated it in the maftir last week in the parasha. So I want to go to last week's parasha. Okay, hold on. I'm going to do a quick share screen. Okay. Okay, first up over here, guys, we have ourselves some genealogy. We have Adam and Eve. We have ourselves 10 generations going down. Get to Noah. World gets destroyed. We have a brand new creation of the world. We have Noah. He has a bunch of kids. If you look over here, from Ham, we're going to Canaan. Those are going to be the ones that are going to be in Israel. He has a bunch more. One of them is going to be Nimrod, who's going to be very important. His grandson, his great-grandson, Nimrod, is going to be very important when we get to the Avram story in the Midrashim. We'll get to that. But then we go down generation. We get to Abraham's. We get to Abraham's father. We have Abraham. We have some other family members. Okay, we'll get back to them a little bit later. Okay, but let's get to the end of last week's parasha. Okay. So the end of last week's parasha, that was a little genealogy tree, a little family tree that I made over there. That family tree is based off of last week's parasha. Because last week's parasha tells us Avram had a father named Terach. Terach had 3 kids, Avram, Nachor, and Haran. Great. Haran, not to be confused with Haran with a head. This is Haran with a hey. H versus CH versus a ha versus a ha. Different sounds. But they're living in an area. They're going to get to a land called Haran with a het. But the guy's name is Haran. Similar names after cities, but not the same name. He has a bunch of kids. Avram's brother Haran dies in Ur Kasdim. And then it says Avram gets married. He marries this lady named Sarai. But Sarai can't have any kids. And they keep moving.
Is this Lech Lecha?
This is the end of last week's parasha of Noah. The very end, like the last verses of Noah.
Okay.
Okay, this is the very, very end of last week's parasha. So it says Avram, it gives you a little bit of genealogy of who Avram is. I mean, we're not introduced to Avram in this week's parasha. We're introduced at the very last aliyah, just a little bit of family tree. But so it tells you Avram gets married, has a wife, Sarai. Their names aren't changed yet. And Sarai can't have kids. She's akara. She's barren. She can't have children. So what does it say? Vayikach Terach. Who's Terach? Terach is Avram's father. Vayikach Terach et Avram beno. He takes his son Avram. Ve'et Lot ben Haran ben beno. And he takes Haran, which had died a second ago. So he takes his grandson. His grandson doesn't have a father anymore. So he takes Lot, his grandson. This is Avram's nephew. Vet Sarai kalato. And his daughter-in-law Sarai. So meaning Avram's father, Terach, is the main player right now. He takes his family. Vayetzu itam mi'ur kasdim lalechet arza Canaan. And they went from this place called Ur Kasdim. We'll get back to this place pretty soon. And they go to a place called Canaan. So people, Sammy, who wants to try to get to Canaan? Who's trying to get to Canaan right now? Isaac, who's trying to get to Canaan right now? We see from here that Avram's not the first.
Avram, his grandson Lot, the son of Haran.
But who's the
his
guy right before?
daughter-in-law,
Who's the guy, the
Sarai.
first guy in the sentence? Who's the leader of everything? Terach, Avram's
Terach.
father. So what do we see right here? There was some kind of move already happening to get to the land of Israel, and it starts by Avram's father. But what's the problem? It says they get to Haran. Haran was the main economic center at the time. That was the New York City where people could make some good money, good school systems. Vayesh Rusham. And they stop and they settle there for a while. And then the Torah tells us, Vayu yimei Terach 5 shanim u'matayim shana. Terach was 205 years old. Vayamot Terach beHaran. What happens? He doesn't make it. He starts, he tries to get there, but ultimately doesn't make it. And then the very next pasuk is Lech Lecha. The very next pasuk starts our parasha. So what do we see? While Avraham wasn't the first to try, his father actually tries. Avraham is the first to actually make it. Avraham pulls through and gets to the end. Deep Hasidic idea, says the Svat Emet. The whole world heard God calling them, come to the land of Israel. But it was only Avraham who actually heeded the call of Hashem. His father understood it and tried, but couldn't make it. It was too much. Made it halfway. Avraham's the first one, though, to make it the full way. Okay, fine. Now, the rabbis come along. We did this class, Be'ezrat Hashem, we're going to do a little bit of background about Avram Avinu, a little bit about his greatness, what he did, what took place. I don't plan to finish the whole parasha. Way too much happens in the parasha, but I want to do some big ideas that I think are going to be with us for the whole book of Bereshit. Yes, Amy.
What's the thing like where he breaks the statues in Noach, or is that in Lech Lecha?
Oh, great question. Great question. We'll get to that. Hold that question. Sammy's question is great. You guys know the story of Avram breaking the idols?
Yeah.
Where does it talk about that?
Isn't that a midrash?
Oh, excellent. Okay, it's a midrash. The Rambam holds that is hidden in the words Ur Kasdim, the pasuk that we saw at the end of Noah, that said that his brother died in Ur Kasdim. Ur in Aramaic means fire, and that might be the fiery furnace. We'll get into that in a second. We'll talk about that midrash, but the main storyline is in the midrash. Let's get to that now. We'll talk about the midrash in a second. What's the midrash? What's the midrash? We spoke about this a little bit last week. Let's bring it up again. What's the midrash? Maybe a midrash. The midrash. What is it?
Like a parable?
A parable. It's a story with a lesson. Do we take it literally or not literally? It's not clear. It's not clear. The Rambam says you take them all literally, you're a fool. You take none of them literally, you're also a fool, meaning it's somewhere in the middle. The lesson is more important than the historical accuracy. But it happens to be this midrash, the Rambam takes literally, because he learns it from the words Ur Kasdim, which means the fire of Kasdim. And it makes a lot of sense that the word Ur is in Aramaic, because where are they? They're in Aram. They're in Aram Naharam. They're Aramean. And before Avram comes to Israel, he's in the Mesopotamia area, which is called Aram, and the language is Aramite. So in Aramaic, the word Ur, which we're going to find in the Gemara all over the place, which is written in Aramaic, the word is fire. So he goes, the fire in Kasdim, that's where it took place. The Rambam learned that hint is saying the story is actually literal, or at least the fire part of it might be. But that's how the Rambam is learning that story. Okay, but we'll get back to that midrash in a second. The rabbis tell us Abraham is tested. He's tested throughout his lifetime. He's given actually 10 tests. Show of hands. Anybody know the 10 tests? Can anybody name the 10 tests? Show of hands. We once had a girl on the program who had actually originally started in Beis Yaakov, didn't make it in Beis Yaakov, ended up going to public school, then came on our program. She actually memorized the song of what the 10 tests were, which I thought was awesome, except there's actually a very big debate amongst the commentators. What's the first test? How do we label those 10 tests? Because some commentators will use the midrashim to explain the tests, and some will only look for what's taking place in the actual Torah. But according to many commentators, this would be the second test of Avraham of Lech Lecha, because the earlier test is the fiery furnace, as Sammy was talking about. Okay. Avram is tested 10 times. Here's the question of, let's talk about tests for a second. Why does Hashem test Avram in the first place? Why does God give us tests? Why does he give Avram tests? To say it's stronger, God knows what Avram is going to do. Why test Avraham? The Rambam writes that in the morning of Vuchim, he goes, why test somebody if God knows the future? What's the point of the test?
To build his faith in Hashem. Maybe.
Oh, very good, very good. What does that mean? But God knows if he's going to have faith or not.
Well, he doesn't know if he's gonna have faith or not. Abraham himself doesn't know if he'll have faith. So
Okay.
it's more for him than for Hashem, maybe.
Jonah, excellent, excellent. That's the answer of the Ramban. Rambam, Maimonides asked this question. Nachmanides gives that answer to the question. The Ramban says, until he actually passed these tests, it's only potential. It's only potential. Once you pass the test, you become that. And as you pass the test, you get harder tests and you grow even more. It's true God knows his potential, but he would never be Avraham if he doesn't actually do it, if he doesn't actually accomplish it. Excellent, Jonah. That's the approach of the Ramban. Eli, I'm not sure where you go by. Yeah.
Isn't it to like prove to the Malachim that he's actually like faithful or something? Like, I
Oh,
actually
interesting.
believe
That's going to be a midrash by the Akedah when he's about to slaughter, when he's the binding of Isaac. That's what the midrash there is going to say, that the Malachim, the angels, are going to question Avraham, and now we want to see if it's real. By Lech Lecha, they don't bring that down as much. That seems to have been an easier test and didn't really prove it. But there's a midrash exactly like that on his 10th test or his 9th test, his hardest test. Any other answers? Why would God test Avraham if he knows what the future is?
Maybe it's to reward him.
Okay, good. Excellent. The Ramban has that as well. The Ramban says it's going to maximize his potential. He's going to know who he is. It's going to make him grow even more. And then he's going to be worthy of reward. Excellent. Excellent. Other ideas?
Maybe it's one of those things where there is no answer, like shotness.
No, people try to give answers. The question might be better than the answer, or the question might be strong enough that we could have many answers. Okay, one thing you should know about me, the way I like to teach my classes is I like a lot of opinions. I like to see different angles, and we try to juggle those angles, because sometimes the angles might even seem contradictory. A lot of times, though, they're complementary. Life is not black and white. Life is very gray. And since life is gray, you could have a lot of reasons behind something. Like when God says, let me test Abraham, there could be a lot behind that test, more than just one answer. So I like the concept of let's see a lot at the same time, and maybe that'll build a much deeper understanding of the story, especially when it comes to Chumash, especially with Bereshit. We're going to have stories happening. We're going to have personalities in a second. We're going to have family dynamics. And we know a family dynamic, when brothers and sisters start fighting with each other, there's a lot of baggage and a lot of stuff behind that fight. And that's why a lot of times the different answers are complementary. And it can even be contradictory and still be complementary, because it's the background behind those relationships. I read once in a book by Rav Akiva Tatz. It's a beautiful idea. He says that, when you learn something, you learn one opinion. He was talking about a Gemara. When you learn one opinion, you might learn one opinion, like how Rashi learns the Gemara. And he says, you ask the questions, you go back and forth, and you're like, oh my God, that's such a great answer, such a great way to learn the Gemara, and you love Rashi. Then all of a sudden, you read Rashi's grandkids in his school, you read the Tosfot, and the Tosfot learns the same Gemara, but they learn it differently. Same words, but they punctuate a little bit differently. They understand it a little bit differently. They ask questions on Rashi, and then they relearn it. And there's another beautiful way, a very consistent way of how Tosfot learns it. And then you say, wait a second, Tosfot had really good answers for Rashi. Maybe there's somebody who could answer those questions. There's actually a rabbi in the Pnei Yoshua who loves to answer the questions that Tosfot has on Rashi. And you open him up and he starts answering Rashi, and all of a sudden you say, whoa, I have a much deeper understanding of Rashi. And then you read the Rambam's approach and the Rosh, and all of a sudden you start to juggle many approaches to the same idea. And he says each approach glows and is beautiful. And he says it's kind of like a diamond with different facets. And once you know it all, you're never going to know it all. But once you know a lot, you're going to start to spin it, and it's going to just shine right back at you. So the idea that I want to do in this class is to actually go through ideas. Like I said, this is level 1 class, which we try to do. It's called Biki. Try to cover a lot of ground. So we want to go through a lot of ideas at the same time. And I think, at least for myself personally, there's a beauty to seeing the bigger picture. Okay. So what's another answer to why is Avraham tested? The Rambam comes along and he's looking bigger picture. The Rambam who asked the question, he says, oh, you know why he's tested? He's tested for us. not just us here in this room, but he's testing us. He's teaching us how to be people. What is morality? How to do the right thing. If Avram doesn't go through these tests and we don't record these tests and we don't see what he does, we would never know how to be good. We would never have that base for being good people. I think we might have said this last week, that Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our fathers, according to the Imam Loez, those ideas of the ethics, they all come from the book of Bereshit. It's called Pirkei Avot, of our fathers, because it's the story of our fathers that teach us how to be good people. So if Avram's not going to be tested, if Avram's not going to pass those tests, so you know what's going to happen? We're never going to know that we could pass those tests. We're never going to know how to handle those tests. But it's a lesson for all of humanity. It starts with us, the Jewish people, and then eventually we're going to try to spread it to the rest of the world. But we're going to learn from this how to be the best people we could possibly be. That's the Rambam's approach. Now, the test of Lech Lecha, very hard test. Why is it a hard test? Because God tells them, leave it all behind. Leave where you came from. Leave your family. Leave your hometown. Leave your family. Leave your father's house. Go to this place that I'm going to show you. And for Avraham, what do we know about Avraham? And we know, what was Avram's main character trait? And we know, what was Avram known for?
Chesed.
Chesed. What is chesed?
Kindness.
Kindness, being a nice, kind person. Avram's character trait is kindness. In the coming weeks, we're going to speak about Yitzchak, we're going to speak about Yaakov, his son, his grandson. Their character traits, what defines them, are going to be a little bit different. They're not going to be necessarily, actually, Yitzchak is going to be totally opposite of Avraham in certain aspects. But Avram is the kind person. He's the one that's always going out there to the people, trying to inspire the people, trying to help the people, trying to feed the people. Avram is all about kindness. To leave his father behind, to leave his family behind, that's antithetical to who Avram is. How can I leave my father behind? My older father, leave him behind in Haran? The test of Avraham, it's a very hard test. God on the one hand is telling you, leave it behind. Straight up mitzvah from God. You got to leave it behind. We got a bigger thing to do for the world. I have a much bigger mission for you. Now that's hard. And that's where you have to ask yourself, Avram has to ask himself, am I kind because I like being kind? Or am I kind because that's the best thing for God? But if God has a bigger mission for me, I have to do the bigger mission. There's actually an initial debate amongst the rabbis if Lech Lecha was a harder test than the binding of his son Isaac. In the end, they say binding was harder. It was a more difficult test. But it's a question, because to leave your father behind, to leave your father behind to make Aliyah, that's very difficult. It's actually so difficult, and people could become so confused, and it's so gray from certain angles that people might mistake and say, how could you do that? Maybe you should fight against God, which that's clearly not the way you should learn this case. That's why, what does Rashi teach us? Rashi tells us, Rashi does some math. At the end of last week's parasha, we learned that his father Terach died at 205 in Haran. He tried to come to Israel, doesn't make it, dies in Haran at the age of 205. Rashi does a bunch of math, and he tells us that his father actually lived for 60 more years since Avram left. So why is the Torah telling us that his father already died if he's still living 60 years? So the simple answer would be, because, okay, we're doing chronology at the end of the parsha. Okay, we're just making things neat, and we're done talking about him. So we're going to say, okay, and he died. Now let's move on to the next story. But Rashi says God had a bigger plan. God didn't want anybody to ever question how could Avram leave his father behind. So we already learned his father died. It's true. It'll be 60 years later, and his father will live for much longer. But according to the way we read it simply, his father's not there anymore. And we have to only learn this lesson in a hidden kind of way for us to realize, whoa, this was a really big test, and Avram passes the test. It's good? Make sense? People with me? Okay, awesome. Okay. Abraham is 75 years old when God tells him to leave Israel. He says, go, Lech Lecha, leave it all behind. And he crosses over the Jordan. He makes the big journey down to Israel, crosses over the Jordan, enters the land of Israel, and he's known now as Avram Ha-Ivri. What does Ivri mean? We translate it in English as Hebrew. The Hebes, this is where the Hebrews come from, where the Hebrews, where they were the Israelite, with Ivriim, the Hebrews, but literally Ivri means to pass over, because he crosses over that Jordan to get the land of Israel. But the rabbis teach much deeper. When he starts following God, is willing to leave it all behind to be God's messenger for the world, he's now known as Avram Ivri, the guy who crossed over, that the whole world is on one side, but he's on the other side. And now from his side of the world, he's chosen monotheism, morality, spirituality, God. And now it's going to be his job to try to bring more and more, or ultimately to create a family that's going to be on this side of the world. Okay. Now, let's go back to what Sammy said. Let's go back to Sammy's midrash. Sammy said, wait a second. There was a midrash that all little kids are taught. You know, when my little kids were in Ganim, when they were in preschool, they would all come home with some kind of project of a fiery furnace and Avraham surviving. And we have earlier stories of Avraham. What's the famous earlier story of Avraham? Okay, so here's the midrash. Anybody know it? Anybody know the general idea of the early story? The earlier origin stories of Abraham that we get from the Midrashim? Okay. Origin stories of Abraham. Says the Midrash. Avram's father Terach, we just said Terach tried to do some nice things, tried to make it to the land of Israel. You can read the commentaries over there why he tried to get to Israel, but it seems to me there might have been something decent about Terach. For those of you that are in Rabbi Khan, anybody in Rabbi Khan's class next period? Anybody have him for Parsha, Rabbi Khan? Okay, those that have him for Parsha, he might go into a lot more detail about Avram's father than I am. Okay, so I'm not going to go into what he's going to say, but he has some very cool ideas about what Avram's father was. But according to Rabbi Khan's understanding of a little bit of the Torah, there might be some very positive of Avram's father. But according to this midrash, there also was quite a bit of negative. And what was the negative? His father, at least at this stage in his life, was an idolater and a seller of idols. By the end of his life, Rashi tells us he's going to do teshuvah. Before he dies, after those 60 years go by, he's actually going to do teshuvah, according to Rashi. But right now, in the early stage of Avram's life, he sells idols. And the story goes, one day, he went off to go do a little business, go to the factory, sees how some of his idols are doing. He leaves for a bit, and he tells little Avram, can you run my store for a bit? And Avram says, okay. And his father puts him in charge. And a guy comes into the store to buy an idol. And Avram goes to the guy, he goes, Alo, why do you want to buy that idol? Do you know when that idol, he goes, how old are you? The guy's like, oh, I'm kind of like 50, 60 years old, which is kind of funny. He doesn't know how old he is. Okay, interesting. But the guy goes, it's probably symbolic, those numbers. But he goes, an older guy, you're 50, 60 years old. You've been around. How old do you think that idol is? That idol was just made yesterday. You think that idol can help you? And the guy's embarrassed, and he walks out. Then this other lady comes in, puts a little food in front of the idol, tries to worship it. Avram is quiet, lets her leave. And then Avram takes a hammer and starts breaking every single idol. His father comes home, walks in, and he sees all the idols are broken. And there's a hammer, except for one, the big one. And the big one, the hammer is in the hand of the big one. He goes to Avram, what'd you do? What happened over here? Avram goes, me? The idol did it. He got jealous of everybody else and he beat them all up. He destroyed them. So his father goes to him, he goes, idols can't do that. So Avram looks at his father and says, Abba, do your ears hear what your mouth is saying? If they can't do that, why are you worshiping the idols? Like, what's wrong with you? Avram is the monotheist. He's teaching the ideas of what God is all about, the initial creator, where everything came from. Avram fast forwards, and his father gets upset about this whole thing and turns him into the leader at the time of Nimrod. Now, Nimrod was the one that was leading the rebellion with the Tower of Babel. There's a fiery furnace in Babel because they're making bricks to build the tower. And Nimrod is the leader who's making these bricks, building this tower. Terach brings Abraham to Nimrod. Nimrod says, Nimrod, my son doesn't believe in idols. Nimrod says, you don't believe in idols? What's going on over here? Show me you believe in idols or I'm going to kill you. Bow down to the fire. Abraham tells him, bow down to fire. But water could extinguish the fire. So Nimrod says, okay, then bow down to the water. He goes, bow down to the water, but the water, they fall from the clouds. So he says, bow down to the clouds then. He goes, bow down to the clouds, but the wind can blow the clouds. He goes, then bow down to the wind. He goes, the wind, but I could withstand the wind. And now he's just making a full circle. So Nimrod says, okay, then bow down to the fire, or I want to throw you into the fire. Because can you really withstand that fire? But what was Avram's lesson to him? Avram's lesson was, hello, the physical world, one thing leads to the next. It's all the same power intermixing. There's no God over there. Nimrod says, bow down, I throw you into the fire. Avram says, throw me into the fire. Nimrod throws him in. Avram survives. Miracle. At the same time, it says that his brother Haran was watching, and they told Haran, jump into the fire too if you believe in your God. Haran was a little bit wishy-washy. Do I believe in God? Do I not believe in God? The Jewish God, idols? He wasn't so sure. He was waiting to see. Once he saw that Avram didn't die, he says, now I'll jump in. He then jumps in. What happens? He dies. Fascinating midrash. Just that last point, interestingly enough, because Haran ultimately dies on Kiddush Hashem. He dies for the sake of God. He sanctified God's name. But you see, there wasn't a miracle for Haran. So even though it was righteous what he did, he died for God. At the same time, it wasn't the level of Avraham, which makes you realize not everybody is treated the same way. Not every action, even though it looks the same, has the same intentions behind it, and it affects how God relates. So it's also a bigger picture that things might not seem fair, or how to define fair. That's really for God's world. Okay, but that's the Midrash bases it off the words that say that Avram's brother Haran died in Ur Kasdim. He died by the fire in Kasdim. That's where this whole Midrash came from. Now, the question is, did the Midrash exactly happen this way? The Rambam seems to think yes. Others might say no, but the message of the Midrash definitely did happen. Because what do we know about Avraham? He was out there teaching monotheism. He was teaching there's a creator. It's like the watch idea that there's always an initial creator. Look back to where you came from. Look back to where things came from. That idol was only created yesterday. You have to understand there must be something greater than the physical. This is deep, deep theology about monotheism that we teach our kids. And if you notice, a little kid could understand this. A little kid could actually understand it a lot of times better than an adult can. But a little kid can understand it on a basic level, and an adult could understand it on a much deeper level. But that's the beauty of the Midrash. We could teach the deepest idea of monotheism in a simple story that a 5-year-old comes home with and is so simple to him, and that an 18-year-old, a 40-year-old, a 60-year-old, an 80-year-old could go deeper and deeper in what monotheism is all about, and how many lessons could come out of this story with Avraham. Question on that story? Question on the story? People know the story? Make sense, the story? Okay. Asks a bunch of rabbis, if this story is so important, why is it only hinted to in the text? So you can say it's only hinted to because the bigger message is what's important, but on a much more straight level, if it's such an important story, write it out, or write out whatever version actually happened. This is Avram willing to die for God, willing to jump into a fiery furnace for God. Why would God not tell us that story straight up? Why only hint to it and learn it from the Midrashim? Why wait for the oral Torah to teach me that Torah? Put it in the written Torah. It's such a big statement that Avram believes in God so much, he's willing to die for God. Okay. So I saw two awesome answers for this question, which on the surface contradict each other, but ultimately I think they don't contradict each other. I think they're both true. Says the altar from Slobodka, a very big rabbi from Slobodka, he says as follows. He says, why? He says, why? Why would God hide this? Because what happens? We are now being introduced to the very first Jew, the guy that God is going to pick to create our whole nation. Now, what would be the problem if the first story that we learn about Avraham is the fiery furnace? What are we going to start to think? We're going to start to think that the only way that we can worship God properly is to jump in a fiery furnace. The only way I could prove my love for God is called Mesirut Nefesh, that I'm willing to die for God. If I'm not willing to be a martyr for God, then I can't be a good Jew. That would be the lesson if that was the very first story in the Torah. But says the author from Slobodka, that's not true. That's not what it means to be a good Jew. You know what it means to be a good Jew? You know what made Avram so great? Avram was so great. What does God expect from us? God's expecting from us the daily things that Avram does, such as being kind, being nice to his wife, pitching her 10th first, teaching people, doing the mitzvot like Brit Milah, just being the basics of a Jew and doing it properly with you. That's what God wants from us. God's not asking us to be a Jew doesn't mean you have to die. Now, there are times, the Midrash, which is now the next level, says there are times when we're going to have to die for God, and we have to be willing to do it. But that's not the base of what it means to be a Jew. That's not the baseline. So in order to show us that's not the baseline, that's not what we're going to focus on in the actual Torah. That's the approach of the altar from Slobodka. Another approach that I saw based on the Lev Eliyahu, he says a little bit of the opposite. He says, okay, so this Midrash tells us we have to die for God. That's like a really big deal to die for God. He says the truth of the matter is, when push comes to shove, there are thousands and thousands of Jews that are willing to die for God, that are willing to die for the Jewish people. We see it here right now in Eretz Yisrael with the biggest tzaddikim in the entire world. We have 300,000 soldiers right now that are willing to die for their ideals, willing to die for our nation. These are the biggest tzaddikim ever. 300 now, but he says throughout history, you have Jews that along the way might not have been the best in all kinds of ways, and might not have been the most exact on a daily basis. But when push comes to shove, they are willing to step it up and die for being a Jew, and that's always been the history of the Jewish people. To live like a Jew on a daily basis, before we do anything, before we do any action in life, to think, is this the right thing to do? Is this the wrong thing to do? What would a Jew do? What would a Kiddush Hashem be? What would be the proper thing to do? Now that's very hard. What was so special about Abraham was that his daily life, he tried in every action, in every interaction with him, with other people, with God, with his family, to try to do the best he could possibly be, step by step. That consistency is what it is to be a Jew. It's true, there are times when we have to do the biggest sacrifice, and that's a really big deal. But that's not the big deal over here. The big deal over here, that's what I'm saying, they're kind of opposites, but they're kind of the same answer from different angle. Avram's daily serving of God and each other and people. You know, in the book I read beautifully once, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, in one of his books, said a beautiful idea. When it comes to the Jewish people, the stories of the Avot, the main stories are not the wars that we fought. You know, a Jewish hero, other religions, you know, Greek mythology, they love the wars. Who is the strong one? The one that can defeat, the one that is the mighty one. In Judaism, who's the strong one? The one that can control his Yetzer Hara. You know, Ezu Gibor Kovesha Yitzro, we say in Pirkei Avot. Who's the strong one? The one that can control himself. Our character traits are midot. Most of the stories in the Torah and Bereshit are about family relationships. How do we deal with jealousy? How do we deal with teaching our children the next generation? How do we treat our wives? How do we treat the people around us, the nations around? How do we deal with everybody? Now, there will be a couple of wars, including in this parsha. We have the war of the 5 kings, the 4 kings. There are some wars in Egypt. We're going to have, when we leave Egypt, we're going to have to fight against Amalek, those evil Amalek. There are times we have to go to war. But the main stories, the primary thing, what makes Avram, what makes Yitzhak and Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Bilhah, what makes them so great? It's what took place in the family, the daily life, the daily character traits that they work with each other, how they try to live their life between each other and with God every day. That's the big lessons. Okay, back to our parasha. Lech lecha. God says to Avram, go for yourself. Lecha. What is lecha? Commentators say that God is saying to Avraham, this is going to be for your benefit. This is going to be great for you too. Now, if you actually take the numerical value, like a nice little remez for the class, lech lecha, lamed kaf, lech lecha comes out to 30 and 20, 30 and 20, 100. Avram right now was 75 years old. Avram was 75 years old. He's going to live until the age of 175, meaning he's going to have 100 more years of life. So if you take that all together, God's saying, Lech lecha, go for yourself. That actually is the numerical value of 100. If you follow this, and as a reward for following this, he's actually going to get the actual numerical value of Lech lecha, 100 years of life, extended life to the age of 175. Okay. God tells him, leave it all behind, going in a difficult order, leave your birthplace, leave your house, your father, that, go to the land of Israel. And he comes to the land of Israel, and he blesses him. You're going to be a great nation. I'm going to bless your name. You're going to be a bracha. Those who bless you will be blessed. Those who cursed you will be cursed. Our Christian allies in America, we have those that are pro us, those that are against us. Our Christian allies in America will always quote this verse when they talk about why one of the reasons why they back us. You know, they're the ones that believe in the Old Testament, they believe in the Bible pretty strongly, and they're saying, okay, those who bless you will be blessed. Therefore, we're gonna be with you, and we're gonna protect you. We're gonna support you, and that's some of our biggest allies based on the pasuk in this week's parasha. And Avram travels with his wife. He brings his nephew Lot. Again, his brother Haran died. He brings Lot with him, and it also says he brings vetanefesh asher asu beharan. He brings the souls that he made in Haran. Who are those souls? So Rashi gives 2 interpretations. Interpretation number 1. He brings those we converted. Avram converted the men. Sarah converted the women. He created a following. part of his big displays, if he's fighting against the evil Nimrod and he's arguing with him in front of everybody and he wins with the miracle does and helps a little bit as well, he starts to create a following. The following comes with him. Another opinion says they're the maidservants that came with him. He has servants. He's turning into a bit of an empire. We're going to see there's going to be a war. He's going to have his 318 men. He's going to win this war. So Avram is becoming a following. He's building things up. They all go with him to the land of Israel. Hashem says, when he gets to Israel, he makes it. He says, I'm going to bless you there. Avram sets up shop. He builds an altar. He's hanging out in the Negev area. He starts off now by the area of Beersheba area, the south, the Negev. And eventually we're going to see the stories are going to basically go back and forth from the Negev to Hebron. Maybe we'll talk about that, maybe not in the future. But geographically speaking, he's by the southern area of Israel, but the northern part of the southern area. We're kind of a little bit next to what's going on today in Israel, where the hot spots are. So he's out there in the Negev. He makes an altar. He serves God, and it actually says a nice idea, a little bit of a shalom bayit. Pitches his wife's tent before he pitches his tent. He's taking care of his wife. We already see Rashi brings out the hint. Oh, why is he doing hers first? Because he really cares about her, really loves her. Already beginning to teach us what it is to have a Jewish husband, a Jewish wife, a Jewish family. And then one last idea. The Ramban says that we also learn a big principle here called Ma'aseh Avot Siman Labanim. Whatever our forefathers do will become a sign, a symbol for future generations, which means whatever they did in a certain aspect, history will repeat itself. Avram and our parsha is going to go down to Egypt. The Jewish people are going to go down to Egypt. Avram's going to come back up with a lot of wealth. So are the Jewish people from Israel. But throughout history, throughout every generation, we're going to have to look back to the Torah because there's going to be a certain spiritual energy that will repeat itself. But also, we're going to get that spiritual energy. So if Avram could make Aliyah and move to Israel and really do we're going to have that strength as a Jewish people, as we've seen in the last 70 years here, to make it back, to take those first steps back. That koach, the spiritual energy, it's called Ma'aseh B'Sim Lebanim. We have the energy that when history does repeat itself, we're going to be able to step it up like our forefathers. Okay, I want to say, okay, that's like the first half. After all this, he gets to the land of Israel. Everything, actually, it's only the first Aliyah still, but he gets to the land of Israel. He's excited. Things are about to get really good. And then all of a sudden, there's a major famine. I want to pick it up with the story next week with what happens when the famine hits the land of Israel. But I do want to say one more idea that's in Rashi in this week's parasha, which I think which is a little bit of a hope for a little bit of the political situation here in Israel. I think it's important. I don't want to get too political. It's not a politics class, but sometimes you can look at the Torah and maybe get some inspiring messages from the week's Torah portion based on what the parsha says. So it's an idea that I was thinking of. Let me know if you like it or not. You can message me afterwards if you think it's a cool idea or not. But Abraham is going to go through a lot of interesting things. There's actually going to be a war that's going to take place. And part of that war, there's going to be these 4 kings against 5 kings. They're going to take Avram's nephew captive later in the parasha. Avram's going to fight a war, and he's going to win. And he's going to bring back the captives. B'ezrat Hashem, we should bring back our captives. And Avram's going to bring back the captives. That's what his family, his nephew Lot, is going to be brought home. Ma'aseh avot siman labanim. May our captives be brought home from this week's parasha. May it be a bracha from this week's parasha. But Avraham brings them back. And then the story is like stopped in the middle. And this guy, Malchi Tzedek, shows up. And Malchi Tzedek, who the commentators tell us is really Shem. Avram's great-great-great-great-grandfather Shem was still alive. That's Malchi Tzedek. He comes and he makes a treaty with Avraham. Rashi says, why does he come now to make a treaty? So there's a weird answer. Rashi says, because he wanted to let Avram know that he was standing beside Avraham. Why would he have to let him know that? Because some of the kings that waged war against Avraham, they were related, they were descendants of this Malchi Tzedek. And Malchi Tzedek wanted Avram to know that I know that those family members of mine are immoral and they were doing the wrong thing and they're evil. And even though I'm related to them, I have the moral clarity to side with you. So I want to give a bracha. We've seen a lot of the world get behind the Jewish people right now, get behind Israel, and we've seen a lot of the world not get behind us. And particularly, the family members of those that were, or the cousins of those that were murdering us are not getting behind us. May this parasha teach us that there are people who can be related to Reshaim, but they can still open up their eyes and say, you know what? We stand with the Jewish people. Okay, if you didn't put your name in, put your name in the chat now for attendance purposes. Those listening later on, send me a message that you're listening.